Hey guys, it's Shaylin, and I'm here today with another writing video. If you guys have been following along my writing vlogs and updates and stuff, you know that I was writing a novel called Holding a Ghost. I finished writing that on June 20th, and so I'm going to do what I've done in past videos where I'm just going to talk about the process, what it was like, what I learned, what the experience was like. I plan to write novels for the rest of my life, and I don't think I'll ever stop learning something new with each one. I did a video like this for my last novel, Honey Vinegar, which I finished like about a year ago, last March. So if you want to watch that video, same style as this, where I just chatted about a book and the process and what it was like, I'll leave that in the cards and in the description. This book, in many ways, took 6 years to write. This tale, which some of you guys might be familiar with, so I'll tell it quickly, begins February 26th, 2015. I know that's very specific. At the time in my life, I was a little sad. 2015 was a rough year. One day, I'm at home, it's pretty late, and I was scrolling through Tumblr because I was a kid on Tumblr. I mean, I was sad. Of course I was on Tumblr. As I was scrolling through Tumblr, I come across a photograph. This photograph changed my life. Wow, I owe things to this photograph. And it was a picture of a gravestone, and it said, "Will not be forgotten," but the name was broken off. And I was like, that's sad, man. I guess I thought that was like the deepest thing I'd ever heard. And I remember immediately thinking, this is a novel. Like, I saw the novel immediately. And I've always been the kind of person who plans books really slowly. That's part of why I discovery write, is because I plan a lot faster when I'm actively writing. But when a book is just an idea in my mind, it takes years. But this idea developed faster than any novel idea ever of my life. Still hasn't happened to this day, maybe it never will. Within an instant, I saw the story. I knew that I wanted to write a story about a main character who would find essentially a gravestone that's broken like this, and is trying to figure out who's buried there. And within 3 days, I had a full outline. I poured everything in my heart and soul into this book. Having something that I could just devote my entire emotional space to was like a blessing. This was my senior year of high school. It was February, and I had a bunch of like really difficult final exams that I had in like my pre-calculus exam and my chemistry exam. And so I knew that if I started writing the book immediately, I would just literally sink everything into that, and I wouldn't study properly for my final exams. My exam scores were really important for my scholarships. Like, I needed them to get scholarship money, and so it was important that I got good exam grades. I think I wrote the first chapter, and then I stopped myself. I was like, no. I waited, and literally the day I was done high school, I was like, let's go. I think I finished it once I started university at the end of September, but it basically took 3 months to write. It really meant everything to me, and this novel was called I'm Fine. The main character was not based on me. Nothing that happens in the story was based on my life. None of the characters were based on people I know. The main character was not based on me, but her emotions were often based on mine. And a lot of passages from that book are just CNF. Some of that book was just creative nonfiction. I was just like, oop, and how I feel now. Like, I think I just used this storyline. It was a storyline unrelated to my life, and I used that storyline to kind of channel a lot of how I felt. And I saw the main character not as a fictional version of myself, because I didn't see her that way at all, and I never saw her as me, but I did see her as almost like a friend who would understand exactly how I was feeling. And so that book was a huge comfort to me, and honestly, I have no regrets about writing it. I think it's what I needed at the time. And the book was young adult. At the time, that's what I was interested in writing. So after I was done the first draft, we'll speed up because this doesn't really matter. Fast forward to the summer of, I think it was the summer of 2017, I edited the novel. I had grown a lot as a person, changed a lot as a person, and as a writer in that time. I think I lost touch with the story because suddenly I was working on a book that was about these emotions of mine that were kind of fresh, but that I wasn't experiencing anymore. And I think I found it really hard to empathize with myself. I think I was like, I don't want to think about that anymore. Like, I'm beyond this. Like, look at me, I'm thriving now. And I was really happy. Here was a book that was a relic of a time where I was not loving my life. I wasn't able to empathize with that version of myself because it was just so fresh, you know? And I took it out on the character, and I was like, yeah, I don't even like this character anymore. She's not interesting. And what that really meant was, I'm not interested in this time of my life anymore because it's painful to look at, you know? I took it out on the character. I did 5 drafts of the book over this summer. And I remember getting to the end of this 5th draft, and I just had this moment where I was like, I spent 3 months working on this, and it's not really better. I just had this sinking realization, I didn't make it better. Sure, the prose is better, and I cut the parts that I think are really cringy, and I tightened up the structure, but I don't think it's that I'm Fine as a narrative was inherently bad, because it wasn't, and if I wanted to continue working on it, I think I could have made it work for sure. I was not happy with just the essence and bones of the story. I didn't like the character anymore. She didn't interest me. I wasn't interested in writing about the place that she had come from within myself. I didn't like the plot line. Like, it was a story that had originally meant so much to me, and I was ready to take this book to the end. Like, I was ready to publish this because it had been such an important story for me, and so I guess I equated that with it will be an important story for other people. And people reacted really positively to the story when I talked about it online. I guess they related to it, and it was like this terrible feeling because I was like, I wish I could love this novel, but I just don't anymore. I don't want to work on it, and I didn't know what to do, but I didn't know how to officially be like, this is going in the drawer. Jump forward a year now, it's the summer of 2018, and I started to just see the book in a different context, and I was like, okay, this is one of two things. It's either a sequel, or it's the book completely re-envisioned. And the more I thought with it, I was like, no, I don't want it to be a sequel. I don't want to write a sequel to this. I think what I need to do is just revive it. I spent months trying to fix the cosmetic aspect, and that really didn't do anything because I didn't like the bones. Like, this needs to be gutted. I could see these fleeting images, but I didn't know how to approach it. Part of what I think clicked the book into place was the arrival of a new character, Nadia. Even though June is the protagonist, I think it's kind of equally their story. It's like their story together. Thank you. Like, this book wouldn't really, I don't think, have happened if it weren't for Nadia. She emerged clearly, beautifully. Nadia is a love interest, and I think at the time, it would have been like, that was the summer of 2018. I was just coming to terms with my own queer identity. And even though I had written queer characters before, I'd never really written a book with like a queer romance. And I think I was really at the point where I was just coming to terms, and after this point, everything I write is gay. To be honest, I think that recognizing that Andy/June, the main character, was bi, which was a big turning point in me realizing that I was bi. It was the same thing. I was at the very end of that 5th draft. I've been working on the book for years, and it hit me suddenly. I was like, oh, like, Andy is bisexual. Like, obviously she is. How have I never noticed this before? It's obvious, but I had never noticed it before. It was also maybe obvious that I was bi, but had never noticed it before, so oversights were being made left, right, and center. But yeah, Nadia's arrival as the love interest, I think, really is what gave this book a lot of life. Yeah, this story wouldn't have happened if it weren't for her, I don't think. So fast forward a couple months, I still don't really know where I'm going with this. It's in the back of my mind, but I don't really know what I want the book to become or what I want from it. I just know that this is something I'm interested in. And I think it was around October or November at this point. Everything clicked. I realized how I wanted to tell the story, like with the ghost narrator. In I'm Fine, there was this dead character that the main character was trying to learn about. At the very end of that 5th draft, I had added a few scenes where the main character essentially hallucinated this dead woman, and they had a brief conversation. I realized that the dead character had to be the narrator. And I had this idea, and I actually don't know where the idea came from, to have the main character be able to see ghosts. The story starts to click, and it gets a title, all coming together, and it starts to feel like its own book. And I'm no longer thinking of it as I'm Fine redone, it's just its own story. I feel like I came back to the main character. She went by Andy in the first book. I call her June now. Her name was always Juniper. The story behind that is that in I'm Fine, her name is Juniper. Her last name is Anderson. And in I'm Fine, she went as Andy as a nickname. And the reason for that is because when I had first named the characters, I had named her Juniper. But then for some reason, in my mind, I just started referring to her as Andy. Don't know why. I decided to just keep both names and make Andy a nickname from her last name. But I always knew, even before I decided to write Holding a Ghost, I'd always known that after the end of I'm Fine, she was gonna start going by Juniper again. So it only made sense for me writing a story now set a few years later in her life when she was like, what, she's 22? I think she was 17. And I find that she would go by Juniper. And now that's how I think of her. Like, I always think of her as Juniper. And June is what I think of her as. It's weird to think of her as Andy. I think other people call her that because I called her Andy for years. So when other people call her Andy, it takes me off guard because I don't even think of her that way anymore. Fast forward a couple months, it's now the spring of 2019. I've been thinking about this book for almost a year, and I'm really excited to write it, but I'm waiting because I'm in the middle of writing another book. I took one day to write the beginning of the story, and it was like one of the best days of writing of my life. I'd settled into this form where I was going to tell the book with June as a second person, and the narrator is the ghost. So, I'd figured out that I wanted the book to be about June. She moves away from her hometown, where she had stayed behind maybe longer than expected to take care of her siblings because their mom had died. And now she's kind of like restarting the life that she'd wanted to have, like the life that she could have had if her mom had never died. But she can see ghosts, and she's been seeing ghosts ever since her mom died, and there were no ghosts, and I'm fine. I wanted the narrator to be a ghost in her house that she meets, and this ghost kind of bonds with her. And so the ghost was telling her story with June as a you. That decision was weird to make because it's like I knew that this was right, but I didn't exactly know why, and I'm glad I stuck with that rather than talking myself out of doing something really because I know that that's a strange way to write a book, right? Flash forward now to 2020, everyone's favorite year. So I finished Honey Vinegar in March. I cannot tell you how excited I was to start writing Holding a Ghost. It's like the story was bursting out of me. It's like I couldn't contain it. It was like I had to just start writing it because it had to be written. And so I think I took 3 days off in between finishing Honey Vinegar and starting Holding a Ghost. Like, there was no rest. I started immediately. And it wasn't as magical as I'd hoped. That beautiful, amazing joyfulness to the writing that I'd experienced when I'd written the beginning about a year before, it was gone. I didn't think that what I was writing was actively bad. It was just, I wasn't excited about it. I didn't hate it, but I wasn't excited about it. I wrote about 20,000 words over a pretty short time period. I don't know, something about it wasn't working. So eventually I put the book aside, not because it wasn't working, but because I had another novel to edit. So I spent some months working on Honey Vinegar, and with that distance between the two, my dissatisfaction for this opening 20,000 words of Holding a Ghost really became more and more apparent. Like, the more time I wasn't working on it, the more I was like, why isn't this working? I had this thought, which was, I think I have to restart it. And I realized that I'd taken the wrong approach to how I was formatting the story. Obviously, I was doing this weird second-person ghost narrator thing. It's not that that was the problem, but just structurally, the book was not set up correctly. First of all, I've been trying to write it in past tense, which made no sense. I think I wanted to write it in past tense just because there's present tense gets hated on so much, especially in adult fiction. In YA, it's the standard. And I guess I felt like because the book used to be YA and I was making it adult, I felt like part of that had to mean taking it from present tense to past tense, even though those things literally don't correlate at all. Tons of adult fiction is in present tense. I was letting some community notions about what present tense is good for get to my head, and so I thought I had to write it in past tense, even though it's illogical. Like, the way the form is set up literally necessitates present tense. It doesn't make sense in past tense. It's completely illogical. And when I would hear the story in my head, it was always in present tense. And so then I was having to convert it to past tense when I was writing. I just formatted it wrong. I was trying to take a story that in my mind was in little vignettes. The main character is a photographer, and so I kind of see the book as a series of photographs. They should just be a bunch of very brief little moments, When I was writing it, it was coming out as just longer scenes. And it didn't make sense. It was the wrong form. And so I realized I have to restart. I need to write it in a vignette style, which is what I'd always wanted, and for some reason it just hadn't come out that way. And I think the form needs to be more experimental. Rather than just writing it in standard narrative scenes, it should be a bit more playful. Chapters can be formatted as whatever they want. Some might be transcripts, some might be lists, etc., etc. Let it be more playful and experimental. So I restarted the book in November for NaNoWriMo. It was instantly better. I knew right away that this was the right choice, and I'm so glad that I decided to restart. And I realized that it had seemed like such a risky choice, but ultimately, like, it wasn't. It had seemed like a big decision, like, oh my god, am I gonna restart my book? What did I have to lose? If I restarted it and it didn't work, I could go back. I still had the old 20,000 words. So it definitely taught me that these big risks and big choices, like, aren't that risky. So I restarted it for NaNoWriMo, and it was delightful. But I had so much fun. I wrote 30,000 words during NaNoWriMo, which was amazing. I didn't know I was capable of writing that much, you know. With Honey Vinegar, that book was slow but steady. I could rarely write more than 10K a month. That book just, it's a much denser novel, and I felt like it took a lot more time to write the words. With this book, it was just like so easy. It was so easy. And the thing about this book is it took 6 years to figure out what the story was and how to tell it. But once I actually figured that out, it was like the easiest novel I've ever written. And then I took December, January, and February off because I had a bunch of other things to do. Like, I don't know, I work on a lot of projects, so I just had a bunch of other writing projects I needed to focus on. And then I came back to the book in March. I did struggle a bit to get back into it, but once I got back into it, it was really easy. There's really not a lot of struggle throughout this whole drafting process. I pretty much just worked on it exclusively from late March through April, through May, and then through June, and the book was done. I didn't take breaks to work on other things, which is also wild because with my last novel, I constantly had to take breaks. I worked on one project for like 3 months, which is unheard of for me. I know it's not that long, it's only 3 months, but I have a short attention span creatively. I can only work on a project for a very short amount of time before I get burned out. Usually like 3 weeks is the longest I can work on one thing before I need to switch it up a little. So the fact that I worked on this for like 3 months straight through is amazing. Really the only hard part, you'll see it in my vlog, which I'm gonna post on Friday. The beginning of the last part was a little tricky, but ultimately it was not that hard. The entire book ended up being around 70,000 words. There were really only 2 points where it was a bit of a struggle, and ultimately neither were a big deal. I'm incredibly proud of this book. And obviously, like, it is still a first draft. I'm not saying that it doesn't need editing and nothing will change. I'm sure a lot will change that I can't even anticipate right now. I don't know, a story that I've been trying to tell for 6 years, I think I finally told it. It took a really long time, and I think I needed to grow so much as a person to realize how to tell this story. It's funny because I think in the end, the thing that allowed the story to actually shine was the point that it diverged from me. June was a very hard character to write while her emotions were being sourced from my emotions. But once she found her own story, and that story wasn't based on me, and that story didn't come from a personal place, it was just her story, her own story. She could finally be her own character. I think that's the thing. It took me 6 years not just to figure out how to tell the story, but to figure out what June's narrative is. June is a very quiet, subtle character. There's nothing really extreme about her. And so it was very hard to understand what is this person's story. This whole process really taught me, like, there's always a way to make it work. Like, your characters and your story are always going to be there for you as long as you love them, as long as you want them to. If you decide you want to quit a project, shelve a project, you can do that. But as long as you want that book to be in your life, it will be there for you. It might change. It might change dramatically, but it's still always going to be there for you. And it came back to me. And I feel like I took out some frustration that I had with my past on this character, and I blamed her. I was like, you're uninteresting. Like, you're not an interesting character to write. I don't want to write your story. And that, it was not true. I just hadn't looked hard enough to find what her story was. I was still thinking that her story was the story that I'd written for personal therapy. And when I wasn't interested in that story anymore, I was like, well, you're just an uninteresting character. But now I found her actual narrative. And that took a long time. I don't think I've ever enjoyed writing something more in my life. I loved writing Honey Vinegar. Don't get me wrong. But it was a challenge. That book was challenging. This book, once I figured out how to write it, which was hard, the pieces really felt like dominoes. And it was a beautiful world to have access to. I loved being there, you know. It's a very different kind of story for me. The characters are all very gentle. They're very soft. Nothing really that extreme or even bad happens in the whole book. It's about life being beautiful. I guess I always felt like sad, dark stories are the best, are the most intellectual. When I think about it, the parts of my life and the times of my life that have the most meaning have been the joyful moments in my life. And so I don't know why sometimes we hold literature to a standard where joy isn't worth writing about, but I do think we overlook joyful stories that are about the beauty of life and the beauty of being a person because they're less intellectual. And look, I love stories about anti-heroes. I love stories that are completely immoral, but I'm glad that I took the time to write a book that's the opposite of that and also find purpose in that and maybe find more purpose in that than anything else I've ever written, even though it's the opposite of what I thought my brand as a writer was. Normally I'm like, yes, immoral people doing war crimes, my fave. This book's the opposite of that. And I don't think that that means that the story isn't important. That's one of the biggest things I learned from writing the story is like, that's worth writing about. You know, my mom will always make fun of me for never writing anything happy. And you know, it's true. I like writing about people who are terrible. But for once, I'm glad I wrote something very soft. It was really, really rewarding. It's not just that it was fun, because my last novel was also really fun. I loved writing that novel. But this one felt easy. Honey Vinegar was fun, but it felt hard. This was fun and it felt easy. And for a long time, I almost didn't trust that. I was like, this is so easy that I feel like something must be wrong and I just can't see it. I think that your writing being easy is probably a sign that something is working. You know? The times where it was tough are because something wasn't working with the story. And I had to figure out that thing. And once I figured out that thing, it became easier again. I really didn't want it to be over because I loved being in that world, you know? I don't know. I've left this book with a new appreciation for a character who has been really important to me for a really long time. When I compare I'm Fine and Holding a Ghost, they're not the same book, right? I don't consider them the same book. There's not a single scene that carried over between them. The cast is almost entirely different. It's a new setting. It's a different year, right? Like, I'm Fine took place in, I don't know, around 2010, probably. Holding a Ghost is set in 1996. It doesn't look the same. Like, the imagery is entirely different. Even June's backstory I had to change. In Holding a Ghost, she grew up on a commune, which wasn't a thing, and I'm fine, she just lived with her family. So it's really a completely different story. Like, emotionally it's different, thematically it's different, topically it's different, aesthetically it's different. Like, it's entirely different. The plot is entirely different. It's completely formatively different. I'm Fine was a young adult contemporary novel written in first person present tense like most YA contemporary. Holding a Ghost is, I don't know, it's adult, it's literary fiction. It's also told in second person, witness omniscient ghost point of view, which I hate saying every single time because it's like, why would you create such an atrocity? And I'm glad that I got to fall back in love with the story after I'd kind of fallen out of love with it. And I've now done that with another project because it was such a rewarding experience to gut the story and literally take everything about it that I didn't like and chuck it and redo it. Writing this book has been genuinely one of the best experiences of my life. I'm excited to see what becomes of it and like what the next stage of that journey will be with the story and see it come together as like an edited final product rather than just a first draft, which is obviously awkward and stumbly in places because it's a first draft. But I'm extremely proud of it for a first draft, and I'm glad that I can also am at a point where I can just be proud of my work. I've talked a lot about my journey with confidence and feeling like I wasn't allowed to be happy with my work unless it was perfect. It's not perfect, it's a first draft, but I still love it. And I'm still so proud of it. You know, I'm sure I'll love the next book too. And I'm sure I'll love the book after that. And I'm sure I'll love every book I write. But this one does hold a really special place in my heart because of the journey that went into it. I could ramble literally for 4 more hours, but I've already been rambling for an hour. So let's close this off. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you have any questions, you can always send me an ask on Tumblr, and I'll see you in another video. Bye.